their case when they tell you that the Chinese economy is slowing down right now and BRI investment is going down? There are two responses. The first one comes from Bloomberg, which explains and post-dates them 2 months ago that Chinese investment into BRI projects is going to be increasing by 14% in the next 2 years and is going to double by 2027. What this means is that even if there was a short-term gap in funding, in the long term we're saying that it's going to be getting solved back for. The second response is that even if funding isn't increasing right now, it's always going to be in the best geopolitical and economic incentives for Xi to be increasing in funding. That's why it's never going to be allowing it to collapse. It would make no sense for all of his chips to be put in one basket, which is the BRI, and for him to allow it to collapse. That's why funding isn't decreasing right now, and that's why their case has really no uniqueness here. But specifically on the idea about the European Union filling in the funding gap, there are three problems. The first one comes from Elliott, which explains that the European economy is in the doldrums right now. What that means for my opponents is that even if they're going to make any investment, it's not going to be made investment overseas, and it's specifically a risky $2 trillion plan. It's going to be domestically. But secondly, we would say, according to Emmett, when we're talking about domestically, the Juncker plan is a $70 billion investment in which European banks, private investors, and the state governments of these European countries are already making contributions. What we would tell you is that it makes much more sense for them to contribute to this infrastructure plan rather than bringing funding over to the BRI. The third response comes from Bloomberg, which explains is that there's no uniqueness on their case because what China has done right now is dubbed the BRI as a free-for-all initiative. What that means is that the European companies and American companies can already join the BRI and they can already fund the BRI. They don't need to be in the BRI in the first place. My opponents aren't giving you a single warrant in their case on why you have to join the BRI in order to fund it or why you have to join the BRI in order to make investments. It's because you don't. Let's talk specifically about this idea about the private investors. They say that legitimacy is going to be going up, but we would say that if there is a legitimacy problem right now, they're not telling you why the European Union joining solves the root of the legitimacy problem. But specifically, what Deloitte tells you is that by 2030, half of BRI investment is already going to be funded by private investors, which means that their legitimacy gap is already being solved back for in the status quo. With that point, they have no uniqueness in their case. But let's go to their first argument about the South China Sea. The first response comes from Kuo, which explains that even if you don't have the BRI, there's still going to be a large expansion into the South China Sea. Specifically, what Kuo tells you is that there's been expansion for the past decade. What we would tell you is that even if the BRI doesn't exist, there's always going to be some level of expansion because this China is always going to be wanting to increase their geopolitical strategies and their economic might over these countries. But the second response is what I would tell you is when they say that there's been no big buildup, that's completely false because what actually happened last year, specifically with China, is they seized Vietnam oil tankers. What we would tell you is that it's already gone over the edge, and there's specifically examples in the past in which tensions have boiled over the edge, but still nothing happened. The third response that we would like to tell you is that there's no probability that China is going to be lashing out in the form of a nuclear war. The worst we've seen is when they took over a Vietnam oil rig, but what happened is Vietnam didn't respond because they knew that they would get crushed by a Chinese attack. It goes the same way for China. Even if they fire out a nuclear war nuke in the first place, we would say that they would receive international sanctions, so that would destroy their economy, which is why no nuclear war has ever started and no war is going to be starting in the future. Let's go to their second argument specifically about the Indo-Pak War. The first response at the top level is that CPEC is not collapsing for two reasons. The first one is because Pakistan is increasing their investments by the billions every single year. What Sharia tells you is that the Pakistan government has increased their funding by 14%. But secondly, China is increasing their own investments by billions and billions of dollars. That's why Don writes 4 days ago that CPEC investments are going to be increasing 11 projects, so it means that they have no uniqueness on their case. But specifically on their first warrant about the idea about emboldening Pakistan, they say that they're going to be hiding behind the United States. But this doesn't make much sense because we say that there's already been a power imbalance for a very long time. Just because there's CPEC in the region does not mean that there's no longer a power imbalance. We would say that Pakistan always knows that as long as India has the United States, there's always going to be some level of power imbalance, there's always going to be some level of emboldening. But what we would say is that even if it's going to be solved back for the CPEC, you should have seen this bright line already because the CPEC has been around for a while, there's been investment around for a while, but you still haven't seen anything in their case materialize. We would say it's because Pakistan knows it's in their best interest not to lash out. But their second argument about Indian lash out doesn't make much sense either because what we would tell you is that India has lashed out in the Kashmir regions many times before. They've militarized the Kashmir regions, they've taken over homes in the Pakistan region, but it's never led to nuclear war. And the reason why comes from Pepperman, which explains that in the Kargil war and the last war, the only war that was really big, what happened is that they limited these skirmishes to small level skirmishes and they never let it turn into a nuclear war because they knew that in the long term it would harm all their best interests, which is why there's no probability on their case.